Go, part 1T, parfati famile. What at first glance, the Arden family looked like the kind of family people secretly wished they belonged to. Go, because they lived in a magnificent white house overlooking the sea, surrounded by old stone walls, tall gardens, silver gates. Go, and ancient trees that moved gently whenever the evening wind came from the coast. And at the center of that beautiful home was Nathaniel Arden. Go, a respected businessman whose name was known throughout the city. Go, a man who had built his company from almost nothing and transformed it into one of the most successful private engineering firms in the region. Go, a man who rarely appeared in public without wearing a perfectly tailored suit, a man who spoke calmly, treated his employees generously, donated money to schools and hospitals. Go, and seemed to possess everything a successful man could possibly want, but despite all his wealth, Nathaniel was most proud of something that could not be bought with money: his family. Go, because every Sunday evening, without exception, he gathered everyone around the long dining table in the center of the house: his wife Elena, his 26-year-old daughter Claire, go, his younger son Julian, and his elderly sister Margaret, who had lived with them for nearly 15 years. And during those dinners, Nathaniel always repeated the same sentence: go, no matter what happens outside these walls, we protect each other inside them. And everyone had heard those words so many times that they had almost become part of the house itself. Go. But Claire had always felt there was something strange about them, because whenever her father said those words, his expression changed for just a moment. Go, as if he wasn't making a promise, but reminding himself of something he was afraid to forget. And Claire had spent years trying to ignore that feeling, because she loved her father deeply. Go, and from her childhood she had believed Nathaniel was the strongest man she knew, the man who could solve any problem, calm any argument. Go, and protect the family from anything the world might throw at them. But when Claire returned home after spending 2 years abroad, she began noticing small things that had never seemed important before. Go, such as the way her father became unusually quiet whenever someone mentioned the old northern district, the way Aunt Margaret would leave the dining room whenever a particular name was spoken. Go, the way Elena sometimes looked at Nathaniel as if she wanted to ask a question but was afraid of the answer, and especially the strange behavior of Adrian Vale. Go, an old family friend who had recently returned to the city after being away for more than a decade, because Adrian was one of those people who seemed to know everything but say almost nothing. Will go, and when Claire first saw him standing beside her father's office window, speaking quietly with Nathaniel, she noticed that both men stopped talking the moment she entered the room. Go, and Adrian gave her a polite smile before saying, "You look just like your mother." A harmless sentence that should have meant nothing, yet something in his tone made Claire uncomfortable. Go, and later that night, while walking through the eastern hallway, Claire heard voices coming from her father's locked office. And although she could not hear every word, she clearly heard Adrian say, "Go, you promised it would never reach them," followed by Nathaniel's low voice saying, "I kept my promise for 26 years. And then there was silence. Go, and Claire stood outside the door wondering what promise they were talking about, because as far as she knew, her father had never hidden anything from the family. But the next morning, go, when she casually asked Nathaniel about Adrian, her father smiled and said Adrian was simply an old friend. And when Claire asked why he had returned after so many years, Nathaniel answered, "Go. Some people return because they miss the past," before changing the subject, and that answer stayed in Claire's mind for the rest of the day, because it didn't sound like an explanation. Go. It sounded like a warning, and over the following weeks, the beautiful life of the Arden family slowly began to feel different. Not because anything dramatic happened, will go, but because tiny details started connecting themselves in Claire's mind. A photograph missing from an old album, a room in the house that had always remained locked. Go, a scar on her father's hand that she had never noticed before, an old silver pendant hidden inside a drawer, and a strange name written on the back of it, Lucian. Go, a name Claire had never heard in her family, and when she asked Aunt Margaret about it, the old woman immediately dropped the cup she was holding, stared at Claire with fear in her eyes, and whispered, "Go, where did you find that?" Claire told her, and Margaret's face became pale before she quietly said, "Put it back exactly where you found it." But Claire refused, asking who Lucian was. Go, and Margaret looked toward the doorway, as if she expected someone to be listening before answering. "There are some questions, Claire. Will go. That should remain unanswered." And that sentence was the first crack in the perfect image Claire had built of her family. Go. Because for the first time she realized that everyone in the house seemed to know something except her, and the more she tried to understand it, go, the more she noticed that her father was watching her differently, not with anger, but with fear. And one evening, while the family stood outside watching the sunset over the sea, go, Nathaniel suddenly looked at Claire and asked, "Have you ever wondered why I built this house here?" Claire smiled and said, "Because you love the ocean." Nathaniel looked toward the horizon and quietly answered, "No, go. Because this is the only place where the past cannot find us." And Claire didn't understand what he meant, but she knew one thing for certain. Go. The The family she had always believed was perfect had been built on a secret, and that secret had been waiting beneath their beautiful home for a very long time. Part 2. Ti nam taiwai ver spoka. The strange thing about secrets inside families was that they rarely remained completely hidden, because even when people refused to speak about them, their silence created patterns, and Claire began noticing those patterns everywhere, especially whenever the name Lucian appeared. Because after Discover Pendant, she began quietly searching through old family records, photographs, and documents stored inside the library, and what she found confused her even more. Because there were references to a young man named Lucian Arden in several old documents from 27 years earlier. But every photograph containing him had been removed. Every letter mentioning him had been torn apart, and his name appeared only in fragments, almost as though someone had deliberately tried to erase him from the family's history. And when Claire confronted her father about it, Nathaniel became unusually serious and told her that Lucian was someone from a very long time ago, and that there was no reason for her to involve herself in old family matters. But Claire refused to accept that answer because she could not understand why a simple family member would need to be erased from photographs and documents. And when she asked whether Lucian had been Nathaniel's brother, her father remained silent for several seconds before saying, Some relationships are more complicated than names. And then he walked away, leaving Claire more suspicious than before. And that same evening she found Adrian Vale sitting alone in the garden, staring toward the sea, and Claire decided to confront him, asking directly whether he knew who Lucian was. And Adrian looked at her for a long time before answering, Your father hoped you would never ask that question. And Claire immediately asked, Why? But Adrian only smiled sadly and said, Because once you know the truth, you can't return to the life you had before. And Claire replied that she would rather know the truth than continue living inside a lie. And for the first time, Adrian's expression softened. Because he seemed to understand exactly what she meant. But instead of revealing everything, he gave her another clue, telling her that 27 years ago, the Arden family had not lived in the beautiful coastal house, but in an old industrial district on the northern edge of the city, where Nathaniel and Lucian had grown up together. And although both brothers had once dreamed of building something together, something had happened that changed everything. And after that night, Lucian disappeared, Nathaniel became wealthy, and the entire family stopped speaking his name, but Adrian refused to tell Claire what had happened, saying only that your father didn't become successful because he wanted money. And when Claire asked what he meant, Adrian replied, He became successful because he believed money could protect people from consequences. A sentence Claire didn't understand until later, when she discovered an old newspaper hidden inside the library wall, dated 27 years earlier, reporting a catastrophic accident at a private research facility owned by the Arden family. An accident that had killed several workers and destroyed an entire section of the facility. And among the names listed as missing was Lucian Arden. But there was something strange about the report, because Nathaniel's name was not mentioned anywhere, even though the facility belonged to him and Lucian. And Claire couldn't understand how her father could have been connected to such an event without anyone ever talking about it, so she went directly to Aunt Margaret, placing the newspaper on the table and asking, What happened that night? Margaret stared at the paper for a long time before finally saying, Your father made a choice. And Claire asked, What choice? But Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she answered, He chose to save one person, and because of that choice, another person was lost. And before Claire could ask who had been saved, Margaret stood up and walked away, leaving Claire with more questions than answers. And that night Claire entered her father's office while he was away, searching through the drawers until she found an old metal box secured with a combination lock. And strangely enough, the combination was the date of Claire's birth, which meant that her father had deliberately chosen her birth date to protect whatever was inside. And when she opened it, she found three things. The silver pendant, an old photograph of two young men standing beside a laboratory, and a handwritten letter with only one sentence visible because the rest had been burned away. If Claire ever learns the truth, tell her I never stopped looking for you. Claire read the sentence again and again. And suddenly she understood that the secret wasn't simply about Lucian's disappearance, because someone had been searching for him for years, and that someone was her father. But if Nathaniel had been searching for Lucian all this time, then perhaps Lucian had never actually died. And for the first time, Claire began to wonder whether the person her father had been protecting the family from was not an enemy at all, but someone who had once been part of the family. And just as that thought entered her mind, she heard footsteps outside the office, quickly closed the box and hid behind the curtain, and when the door opened, Nathaniel entered with Adrian. And Claire heard her father whisper, He contacted me again, and Adrian replied, Then the past has finally found you. Before Nathaniel answered, No, it found Claire. And Claire's heart stopped, because suddenly she realized that whatever secret had been buried for 27 years, she was no longer just a witness to it. she was part of it. Go, part 3, TIDHTAE VERYTI Chine. Claire spent the next several days trying to understand why her father's greatest fear seemed to be connected to her. And the more she searched, the more confusing the story became, because she discovered that Lucien had not simply disappeared after the accident, but had been accused of causing it, and according to several old records, Lucien had supposedly stolen confidential research from the family company before fleeing the city, which meant that Nathaniel had every reason to hate him. Yet the letter inside the metal box suggested something completely different. And Claire couldn't understand why her father would continue searching for someone he supposedly believed was responsible for the destruction of their family's future. So she confronted Nathaniel again. This time refusing to leave until he answered, and she asked him whether Lucien had betrayed the family. But Nathaniel looked exhausted rather than angry and said, Lucien didn't betray us, which immediately shocked Claire because it was the first time he had admitted that the official story was false. And when she asked what really happened, Nathaniel closed his eyes and said, "There are things I did 27 years ago that I cannot change." And Claire replied, "Then tell me what you did." But Nathaniel couldn't answer. And that silence hurt Claire more than any confession could have. Because she realized that her father was still choosing silence even after she had discovered the truth was different from what she had been told. And she accused him of treating her like a child. But Nathaniel responded that everything he had done was to protect her, and Claire asked, "Protect me from what?" And he finally said, "From the people who wanted your family destroyed." But he refused to explain further. And that night Claire went to Adrian, who finally agreed to tell her part of the story, explaining that Nathaniel and Lucien had once been inseparable brothers who worked together on a revolutionary energy technology that could transform the city's entire power system. But the project attracted powerful people who wanted to control it. And when Nathaniel discovered that several investors planned to use the technology for military purposes, he wanted to destroy the research, while Lucien believed they should expose the conspiracy, and their disagreement became worse when one of the investors threatened their family. And on the night of the accident, someone sabotaged the facility, causing a massive explosion, and Lucien stayed behind to rescue trapped workers while Nathaniel escaped with Elena and Margaret. Believing Lucien had died, but Adrian revealed that the official report had been deliberately falsified because someone powerful wanted everyone to believe Lucien had caused the accident. And Nathaniel accepted the blame for certain parts of the incident because he believed it was the only way to protect the surviving family members. But what Adrian did not explain was why Lucien had never returned, and Claire demanded the answer. Finally, Adrian admitted that Lucien survived. But he had been severely injured and forced to disappear because the people behind the conspiracy were still searching for him. And Nathaniel had spent the next 27 years building his company, gathering resources and secretly searching for his brother while pretending to the world that he had moved on. And Claire felt a strange mixture of anger and sadness because suddenly the father she had admired was no longer simply a successful businessman. He was a man who had spent decades carrying guilt. And she began to understand why he had always been so strict about protecting the family, why he hated discussing the past, and why he had taught his children that family must always protect one another. But understanding did not erase the pain. Because Claire still felt betrayed that her father had allowed her to grow up believing everything was perfect while hiding something that had shaped their entire family. And then came the most shocking revelation, because Adrian told Claire that Lucien had recently contacted Nathaniel not to ask for money, not to demand revenge, but to warn him that the people responsible for the old conspiracy had discovered Claire's existence and believed she possessed something that belonged to the original research. And Claire immediately asked what that meant, but Adrian said he didn't know. And that was when Claire remembered something from her childhood. A strange childhood illness that doctors had never explained, a faint scar near her shoulder that appeared after she was born, and the silver pendant that had been kept inside her father's locked box. And suddenly she realized that perhaps the secret wasn't simply about what happened 27 years ago, but about something that happened on the night she was born. Because Nathaniel had not merely been protecting his daughter from the past, he had been protecting the past from his daughter. And when Claire returned home that night, she found her father standing alone in the hallway holding the same silver pendant. And when he saw her, he didn't ask where she had been. He simply said, "You know now, don't you?" And Claire answered, "Not everything." And Nathaniel looked at her with tears in his eyes before saying, "Then there is still time." Part 4. Teacher while Nathaniel finally took Claire to the oldest part of the house, a section she had never been allowed to enter. And behind a large wooden bookshelf was a hidden door that opened into a narrow underground room filled with old documents, photographs, medical records, research equipment, and dozens of boxes containing evidence from the night of the accident. And Claire stood in silence as her father explained that after Lucien disappeared, he had spent years trying to reconstruct what had happened, but the deeper he investigated, the more dangerous the truth became, because the accident had not been caused by Lucian, Nathaniel, Go, or any ordinary mistake. It had been engineered by a secret group that wanted the family's technology, and the explosion had been designed to destroy the facility while making Lucian appear responsible. Go, but there was something else Nathaniel had never told anyone, something that even Elena had only learned much later. Because during the final hours before the explosion, Go, Lucian had discovered that the energy system they had created could be stabilized using a rare biological response, Go, and the only person who possessed that response was an infant who had been born into the family that same week, Claire. Go, and Nathaniel explained that Claire's mother had been pregnant while the research was being conducted, and unknown to everyone, the experimental system had interacted with Claire before she was born, Go, leaving a unique biological signature inside her body, and that signature was what the people behind the conspiracy had been searching for, Go, because they believed Claire could be used to recreate the technology, and Nathaniel had spent her entire childhood protecting her without telling her why. Well, Go, which explained the constant security around the house, the private doctors, the unusual restrictions, and even why Nathaniel had refused to allow Claire to undergo certain medical tests, Go, but Claire was devastated by the revelation because she realized that many of the choices she had once interpreted as love had also been forms of control, Go, and she asked her father why he never trusted her enough to tell her, and Nathaniel answered that he was afraid she would hate him, and Claire replied, I hate that you lied to me, Go, not that you protected me. And that sentence broke something inside him, because Nathaniel finally admitted that his greatest mistake had not been the choices he made 27 years ago, Go, but the years of silence that followed, because every time he chose not to tell the truth, he believed he was protecting Claire, Go. But he was actually creating a future where she would eventually discover everything without understanding why he had done it, and before they could continue, Go. The lights in the underground room suddenly went out, and Nathaniel immediately grabbed Claire's arm and whispered, Don't move. Because he knew someone had entered the house, Go, and for the first time Claire saw fear in her father's eyes, not the controlled fear of a businessman facing a crisis, but the raw fear of a father who knew exactly what the enemy was capable of, Go. And footsteps echoed above them, followed by the sound of breaking glass, and Nathaniel quickly opened another hidden passage leading toward the cliffs behind the house, Go, telling Claire to run while he stayed behind. But Claire refused to leave him, saying she had spent her entire life being protected and she would not abandon him now. We'll go. And Nathaniel smiled sadly before telling her that was exactly why he had been afraid of this moment, because he had always wanted his daughter to remain innocent, Go, but she had grown into someone stronger than he expected, and together they escaped through the underground passage, eventually reaching an abandoned lighthouse where Adrian was waiting, and there, Go, under the light of the storm, Claire finally met the man she had only known as a name in old photographs, because Lucian Arden was alive, older, scarred, Go, and carrying the weight of 27 years of loneliness. And when he saw Claire, he didn't say anything for several seconds. He simply stared at her with tears in his eyes, and then he whispered, Go, you have your mother's eyes, before turning toward Nathaniel and saying, You promised you would never let her learn this way? And Nathaniel answered, I tried. And Lucian replied, Go, you tried to protect her from the truth, but the truth was never your enemy, Nathaniel, your fear was. And Claire stood between the two brothers, Go, realizing that the story she had been searching for was much larger than she had imagined, because now the people who knew the truth were finally standing together, Go, but they had no idea that the person who had caused the original disaster had been waiting 27 years for exactly this moment. Go, Pot, Fi-Ho Desipi, Ear to Lucian told Claire everything he could remember, but even his story contained gaps, Go, because the explosion had left him with permanent injuries and destroyed parts of his memory, yet he remembered enough to explain why he had disappeared, and his reason was not cowardice, betrayal, Go, or revenge, but sacrifice, because after surviving the explosion, he had discovered that the people behind the conspiracy were still hunting the Arden family, Go, and when he realized that staying near Nathaniel would put Elena, Claire, and Julian in danger, he chose to disappear, allowing the world to believe he was dead, Go, while secretly investigating the organization responsible for the attack, and for years he moved from city to city, Go, following fragments of information and trying to discover who had ordered the sabotage, but every time he got close, someone disappeared, evidence vanished, or another person was silenced, Go. And eventually Lucian discovered that the conspiracy reached much further than their company, involving politicians, investors, scientists, Go, and even members of organizations that were supposed to protect the public, which explained why Nathaniel had never been able to expose the truth, Go, because one wrong move could have destroyed the entire family, and Claire listened quietly, but she couldn't stop herself from asking the question that had haunted her since the beginning, Go, if you loved us, why didn't you come back? And Lucian looked at her with sadness before answering, Go, because loving someone doesn't always mean being near them. And Claire didn't like the answer, because she wanted something simpler, Go, something that would make the 27 years of separation easier to understand, but Lucien continued, explaining that he had watched Claire grow from a distance. Go. Sometimes seeing photographs of her in newspapers, sometimes hearing about her achievements through people he trusted, and every time he wanted to return, go. He remembered the faces of the people who had died because of the conspiracy, and he feared that his return would bring the danger back to her. But Claire told him that the danger had already returned. Go, and Lucien finally admitted that he knew, which was why he had contacted Nathaniel, because the person who had ordered the original attack had recently resurfaced, and that person was Marcus Vane, Go, a former partner of the Arden brothers who had disappeared after the accident and was believed to have died years ago. Go, but Marcus had built a new identity and quietly gained influence over the same institutions that had once helped cover up the truth. Go. And now he wanted Claire because her unique biological signature was the missing component required to recreate the technology. But there was another reason. Go, one that made Nathaniel visibly uncomfortable, because Marcus blamed Nathaniel for everything, believing that Nathaniel had stolen his future, destroyed his reputation, Go, and caused the death of his own family during the original explosion. And while Claire initially saw Marcus as a simple villain, Lucien warned her that the truth was more complicated. Go, because Marcus had once been a friend and his actions had begun with ambition rather than cruelty, but after years of betrayal and loss, his desire for control had consumed him. Go. And this was exactly what made the situation dangerous, because Marcus did not believe himself to be evil. He believed himself to be correcting an injustice. Go. And Claire began to understand the central problem of her family, that everyone involved had a reason for what they had done, even when those reasons caused terrible consequences. Go. And that realization made it harder for her to decide who was right, because Nathaniel had lied to protect his children. Lucien had disappeared to protect them. Go. Marcus had pursued power because he believed he had been wronged, and even Elena had hidden information because she feared losing her family. Go. And when Claire returned to the house with Nathaniel and Lucien, she found Elena waiting in the living room. And the moment she saw Lucien, she began to cry, not because she was surprised, Go, but because she had known for years that he was alive, and Claire stared at her mother in disbelief, asking, "You knew?" And Elena nodded, saying, "Go. Your father thought he was protecting you by keeping the secret. Go, but I knew one day the truth would find us." And Claire felt her heart break because she suddenly realized that almost everyone she loved had been living with the same secret. Go. While she had been the only person excluded from it, and before anyone could explain further, Elena took Claire's hand and whispered, "Go. There is one more thing you need to know about the night you were born." And that was when Claire understood that even Lucien's story was not the final secret. Go par 6thurth Abby Oitar Elena had spent 26 years carrying a truth she never wanted to tell her daughter, because on the night Claire was born, Go, the original research facility had already been under surveillance, and Nathaniel and Lucien knew that someone was planning to steal their technology. Go, but they had no idea that Claire's birth would become part of the conspiracy. And after the explosion, Go, doctors discovered that Claire's body had somehow absorbed a microscopic energy pattern from the experimental system, something that should have been impossible. And instead of exposing it, Go, Nathaniel secretly moved her medical records, changed the official details of the incident, and built his entire future around keeping her safe. Go, which meant Claire had grown up believing she was an ordinary daughter of a wealthy family, while her father quietly monitored her health, protected her from certain people. Go, and maintained relationships with doctors who knew the truth. And when Claire asked why nobody had ever told her, Elena said, Go, because every person who knew too much became a target. And Claire looked at her father and asked whether he had ever trusted her. And Nathaniel answered, Go, more than anyone. But Claire replied, "Then why didn't you trust me with my own life?" And Nathaniel had no answer, because that was the part of the story he could no longer defend. Go. And he finally admitted that he had been so afraid of losing Claire that he had forgotten she deserved the freedom to choose what to do with the truth. Go, and this confession changed Claire's anger into something more complicated, because she could finally see the frightened man beneath the powerful father. Go. A man who had spent decades pretending to have control while secretly terrified that one mistake would destroy everyone he loved. But before Claire could forgive him, Go, Marcus Vane appeared on every television in the house, announcing that he had obtained enough evidence to expose the Arden family. Go. And he claimed that Nathaniel and Lucien had been responsible for the original accident, that they had stolen research from innocent scientists. Go. And that Claire herself was the product of an illegal experiment, and suddenly the family was surrounded by journalists, investigators, and government agents. Go, while people who had once praised Nathaniel began calling him a criminal, and Claire watched her father's reputation collapse within hours. Go. But what hurt her most was seeing Nathaniel refuse to defend himself, because he knew that revealing the full truth would expose Claire's condition and make her an even greater target. Go. So once again, he chose silence, and Claire finally understood the tragedy of her father, because he had spent his entire life believing that sacrifice meant carrying everything alone. And she told him, Go. You don't have to protect me by yourself anymore. And for the first time, Nathaniel looked at his daughter not as someone he needed to protect, but as an adult capable of standing beside him. Go. And the family decided to fight back not by hiding the truth, but by revealing enough of it to expose Marcus, and they began gathering the original research documents, the missing financial records, the evidence from the explosion and testimony from people who had survived. But Marcus anticipated their plan, and before they could release everything, he kidnapped Adrian, forcing the family to make an impossible choice because Marcus offered to trade Claire in exchange for Adrian's life, and Nathaniel immediately refused, saying he would never sacrifice his daughter. But Claire shocked everyone by saying she would go, because she believed that if she remained hidden, the conspiracy would continue forever, and Nathaniel begged her not to do it, telling her that he had already lost one brother and nearly lost her once. But Claire looked at him and said, "You taught me that family protects each other? Go. But protection doesn't mean locking someone inside a cage." And Nathaniel finally understood that his daughter was no longer the child he had spent 26 years protecting. And with tears in his eyes, he agreed to trust her, knowing that this might be the hardest decision he had ever made. Partie 7. Lastly, Claire entered the abandoned research facility alone, carrying the silver pendant and a small device Lucian had given her, while Nathaniel, Lucian, Elena, and the remaining members of their team waited outside. And as Claire walked through the ruined corridors, she saw traces of the past everywhere: broken laboratory equipment, burned walls, old photographs, and fragments of the life her family had tried to erase, until she reached the main chamber where Marcus was waiting beside Adrian, and Marcus looked at her not with hatred, but with something closer to disappointment, telling her that he had expected Nathaniel to send someone else. And Claire replied that her father had finally learned to trust her. And Marcus laughed bitterly, saying, "Trust? Your father doesn't know how to trust anyone," before explaining that Nathaniel's greatest weakness had always been his belief that he could control every consequence. And Claire realized that Marcus knew her father very well, perhaps better than she had expected, because the two men had once been partners. And Marcus revealed that the original accident had not begun because he wanted power, but because he believed the technology could save thousands of lives. While Nathaniel had wanted to destroy it after realizing its dangers, and during their argument, Marcus had secretly attempted to activate the system, causing the explosion that killed innocent people. But then he blamed Lucian to hide his own mistake, and Nathaniel had discovered the truth too late. Which meant that the family had spent 27 years suffering because of a lie created by one man's fear of consequences. And Marcus admitted that he had spent those years trying to rebuild the technology, but every attempt failed because Claire's biological signature was unique, and he believed that if he could use her, he could finally complete what he started. But Claire asked him why he was still doing it after so many people had died. And Marcus answered, "Because if I stop now, then all those deaths mean nothing." And Claire realized that this was the real tragedy of Marcus, because he was no longer trying to achieve his original dream. He was trying to justify the sacrifices he had already made. And that was when Nathaniel entered the chamber, refusing to allow Claire to face Marcus alone. And the confrontation between the two men became deeply personal, because Marcus accused Nathaniel of destroying his life, while Nathaniel admitted that he had made mistakes but refused to accept blame for choices Marcus had made himself. And Marcus finally asked Nathaniel why he had never exposed him. And Nathaniel answered, "Because I was afraid that if I told the truth, my children would become targets." And Marcus laughed, saying, "And now look at them, standing in the middle of the truth anyway." And Nathaniel looked at Claire, then at Lucian, and finally understood that hiding the past had never protected the family. It had only delayed the moment when everyone would have to face it, and instead of fighting Marcus with force, Nathaniel placed the original research documents on the ground and said, "You want the truth? Then take it, but everyone will see it." And Lucian activated the recording system, broadcasting the evidence to the outside world, while Marcus desperately tried to stop them. But Adrian, despite his injuries, managed to help disable the machine, and for the first time in 27 years, the truth about the accident became public, including Marcus's role, Nathaniel's silence, Lucian's sacrifice, and the existence of Claire's unique connection to the technology, and the world watched as the perfect Arden family finally admitted that they had never been perfect at all. And when the authorities arrived, Marcus was arrested. But instead of celebrating, Claire stood beside her father and realized that revealing the truth had not magically repaired everything, because the family still had wounds, questions, and years of lost time. But at least the lies had finally stopped growing. Part 8R, Pedramans after RT the days after the revelation were harder than anyone expected. Because the world had always admired Nathaniel Arden as a perfect businessman, a devoted father, and a respected philanthropist. And now newspapers described him as a man who had hidden a major conspiracy for decades, while others defended him as a father who had sacrificed his reputation to protect his family. And Nathaniel himself refused to argue with either side, saying that people had the right to judge him based on what he had done? Well, go. Because he finally understood that protection could not mean controlling how other people saw the truth, and inside the Arden house, things became strangely quiet. Go. Because for the first time, nobody needed to whisper anymore. Nobody needed to hide photographs. Nobody needed to leave rooms when certain names were mentioned. Go. And yet the silence was not immediately peaceful. Because Claire struggled with the fact that understanding her father did not erase her anger. Will go. And Nathaniel understood that forgiveness could not be demanded simply because he had good intentions, so he gave her space. And that distance became one of the hardest things he had ever endured. Go. Because for 26 years he had measured his life by how close he could keep his children. Go. And now he had to learn that sometimes loving someone meant allowing them to walk away until they were ready to return, while Lucian began rebuilding his relationship with the family. Will go, but that too was difficult because Julian, who had spent his entire life believing that his uncle was dead, was angry that Lucian had stayed away for so long. Go. And Lucian accepted that anger without defending himself, telling Julian that he had no right to demand forgiveness, only the chance to earn it. Go. And slowly the family began having conversations they should have had decades earlier, conversations about fear, guilt, responsibility, and regret. Will go. While Elena admitted that she had sometimes resented Nathaniel for making decisions without telling her, even though she understood why he had done it. Go. And Nathaniel finally apologized to her without excuses, saying that he had confused being responsible with being alone, and that sentence changed something between them. Go. Because Elena realized that the man she had loved had been carrying a burden so heavy that he had forgotten how to share it. Will go. And Claire also began to understand that the truth did not automatically create happiness, because sometimes the truth created pain first, but it gave people the chance to choose what happened next. Go. And that was something the family had never truly had before. And one evening, Claire walked along the coast with Adrian, asking him why he had waited so long to tell her the truth. Go. And Adrian answered that he had been afraid that the truth would destroy the family, and Claire smiled sadly and said, almost did, before adding, go. But the lie nearly destroyed us first. And Adrian nodded because he knew she was right, and as the sun disappeared behind the sea, go. Claire realized that she no longer wanted to discover every secret her family had ever kept, because there was a difference between understanding the past and becoming trapped inside it. Go. And for the first time, she felt free to choose what kind of relationship she wanted with her father, her mother, her uncle, and even herself. And when she returned home, she found Nathaniel sitting alone at the dining table, the same table where he had repeated the words about protecting the family for so many years, and Claire sat beside him. And after a long silence, she said, I don't forgive everything yet. And Nathaniel nodded, saying, you don't have to. And Claire continued, but I don't want to lose you while I'm trying to understand you. And Nathaniel looked at his daughter with tears in his eyes, because those words meant more to him than forgiveness. They meant that there was still a future, and Claire finally understood that forgiveness was not pretending the past never happened. It was deciding that the past would not control every moment of the future, and that night, for the first time, the entire family sat around the table without secrets between them. And the silence that followed was different from all the silences before, because it was no longer the silence of fear, but the quiet of people who had finally said everything they had been afraid to say. Part 9, THEN Icho Sisi Shretza months passed, and the Arden family slowly began rebuilding its life. But the house itself seemed different, because rooms that had once felt mysterious became ordinary, locked doors were opened, old photographs were returned to albums. And the underground chamber where Nathaniel had stored 27 years of secrets was transformed into an archive where the family kept the truth instead of hiding it. While the technology at the center of the conspiracy was placed under public supervision, ensuring that nobody could ever again control it for personal power. And Nathaniel stepped away from his company for a while, allowing others to lead it while he focused on repairing the relationships he had neglected. And Claire decided not to inherit the business immediately, choosing instead to build a foundation dedicated to helping families affected by corporate disasters and hidden institutional crimes. Because she believed that the greatest lesson of her family's story was not about technology, wealth, or conspiracy, but about what happened when people believed they had to carry impossible burdens alone, and Lucian became involved in the foundation as well. Though he still struggled with ordinary family life after decades of living alone, sometimes forgetting how to sit comfortably at the dinner table. Sometimes waking in the middle of the night because he expected someone to be chasing him, and Julian slowly became the bridge between the brothers. Joking that Nathaniel and Lucian were both too stubborn to admit when they were wrong, and although Nathaniel initially resisted the joke, eventually even he laughed. Because for the first time in decades, laughter inside the house did not feel forced, and one afternoon Claire found her father standing beside the old silver pendant, staring at it. And she asked whether he regretted everything, and Nathaniel answered that regret was complicated, because he regretted many decisions but did not regret loving his family. And Claire asked whether he would do everything differently if he could return to the beginning. And Nathaniel thought for a long time before saying, "Go. I would tell you the truth sooner." And Claire smiled because that was the answer she had wanted to hear, not because it changed the past, go, but because it showed that her father finally understood what had gone wrong. And later that evening, Nathaniel and Lucian stood together on the balcony overlooking the sea, go, talking about the brotherhood they had lost in the years they could never recover. And Lucian asked whether Nathaniel believed they could ever truly make up for lost time, and Nathaniel answered, no, which surprised Lucian, but then Nathaniel continued, we can't recover what we lost, we'll go, but we can stop losing more. And Lucian smiled because sometimes the strongest form of forgiveness was not forgetting the past, but refusing to allow it to take anything else. And inside the house, go. Claire watched them through the window and realized that the family had changed not because the pain disappeared, but because they had learned how to carry it together. Go. And she thought about the question that had haunted her since the beginning, whether truth was always better than a lie. And she finally understood that truth was not automatically kind. Go. And it was not always easy, and sometimes it could destroy the life people had built. But truth gave people something lies could never give them, the ability to make informed choices. Go, the ability to forgive honestly, and the ability to build something new without pretending the old wounds never existed. And that was why the Arden family survived, not because they were perfect, will go, but because eventually they stopped trying to be perfect. And one evening, Claire walked through the house alone, passing the dining room, the library, the old office. Go. And finally, the eastern hallway, where she had first heard the whispered conversation about the promise that had started everything. And she realized that the hallway no longer frightened her. Go, because there was no mystery left inside it, only history, and history could be painful without being dangerous. And as she reached the end of the corridor, she saw Nathaniel standing there. Go, and he smiled, asking whether she was all right, and Claire answered, for the first time, I think I am. And Nathaniel nodded, and together they walked toward the dining room. We'll go, where the rest of the family was waiting, and for the first time in 27 years, nobody was waiting for a secret to destroy them. Per 10, TGT Daos to KEP years later, go. People still talked about the Arden family, but the story had changed because they were no longer known simply as the wealthy family whose father had hidden a dangerous secret, will go, nor were they remembered only for the scandal surrounding the old research facility, because over time, what people remembered most was how the family responded after the truth came out, go. And Claire eventually became the head of the foundation she had created, helping thousands of people who had been harmed by institutions that chose secrecy over responsibility, go, while Julian became a lawyer specializing in corporate accountability and Lucian returned to research, will go, dedicating his life to ensuring that the technology he had once helped create could never again be used without ethical oversight, go. While Nathaniel retired from business completely and spent his later years doing something he had never been good at before, simply being a father, and perhaps that was the greatest change of all, go, because Nathaniel no longer tried to protect his children from every painful truth. Instead, he trusted them enough to face those truths themselves, and Claire often visited him at the old coastal house, Goka, sometimes bringing work, sometimes bringing friends, and sometimes bringing nothing at all, because she had finally learned that family did not always need a reason to gather. And one evening, go, many years after the events that had changed everything, Claire stood on the balcony overlooking the same sea where her father had once said that the past could not find them. Go. And Nathaniel stood beside her, older now, his hair gray, his face softer, and his eyes carrying a piece that had been missing for most of his life. And Claire smiled and asked, "We'll go. Do you still think this house can keep the past away?" Nathaniel laughed quietly and shook his head, saying, "No, I was wrong about that." And Claire asked, "We'll go. Then why did you build it here?" And he looked toward the horizon before answering, "Because I thought I needed a place where the past couldn't reach us. Go. But now I understand that I didn't need to run from the past. I needed to stop being afraid of it." And Claire took his hand, and for a while neither of them spoke, go, because there was nothing left that needed to be explained. And somewhere inside the house, the old silver pendant remained locked in a glass case, not because it was dangerous anymore, go, but because it represented a chapter of their family history that should never be forgotten. And beneath it was a small plaque Claire had written herself, containing only a few words, go. A secret can protect someone for a day, but trust must protect them for a lifetime. Those words became the principle of everything the Arden family built afterward. Go, and perhaps that was the real ending of their story, because the mystery had never truly been about the technology, the conspiracy, the missing brother, or even the secrets surrounding Claire's birth. Go. Those things were only the surface, while underneath them was something much more human, the fear of losing the people we love. The mistakes we make while trying to protect them, go. The lies we tell because we believe the truth will hurt more. and the painful realization that sometimes our attempts to protect the people we love can become the very things that hurt them most. Go. Nathaniel had spent 26 years believing that love meant carrying every burden alone. Lucian had spent 27 years believing that love meant disappearing. Well, go. Alana had spent years believing that silence could preserve peace, and Claire had spent years believing that a perfect family was a family without secrets. Go. But all of them eventually discovered that none of those beliefs were true, because love was not the absence of fear. It was the courage to face fear together. Family was not simply blood. Go, it was responsibility, honesty, patience, and the willingness to remain even when the truth became difficult. And forgiveness was not forgetting what happened. Go. It was accepting that people could make terrible decisions without becoming entirely terrible people, and that was why the Arden family survived when so many other families would have fallen apart. Go. Because after 27 years of secrets, they finally learned something simple, something they should have understood from the beginning. The truth may break a family for a moment. Go. But a lie can slowly break it forever. And as the evening light faded over the sea, Claire looked at her father and smiled, knowing that there would always be things in the past she could never change. Go. People they could never bring back, years they could never recover, and wounds that might never completely disappear. But she no longer feared those things. Go. Because the past was no longer a locked room inside their house. It was simply a part of their story. And stories did not have to end where the pain began. Sometimes they continued through forgiveness. Go. Sometimes through responsibility, sometimes through the courage to admit that we were wrong, and sometimes through the simple decision to stay. And on that quiet evening beneath the fading sky, go. The Arden family stayed together, not because they were perfect, not because they had forgotten their mistakes, and not because their past had magically disappeared, will go, but because they had finally learned to face it together. And perhaps that was the greatest secret of all. The truth that had been hidden beneath the silver house for so many years. Go. The truth that no machine, no fortune, no reputation, and no powerful person could ever change. A family is not defined by the secrets it keeps. Go. But by what it chooses to do after the truth finally comes out. Part 11. Tia Chetrafrabtaya Pesti 10 years had passed since the truth about the Arden family had become public. Go. And although the world had slowly moved on, Claire had never completely stopped thinking about the people who had disappeared from their lives during the years of secrecy. Go. Because even after the conspiracy was exposed and Marcus Vane was sentenced, there were still unanswered questions about several people who had been connected to the original research project. Go. And one of those questions returned unexpectedly on ordinary autumn morning when Claire received a letter addressed in handwriting she immediately recognized. Go. Even though she had not seen it for years and the name written on the envelope was Adrian Vale, but Adrian had died 3 years earlier. Go. Which meant the letter had been written before his death and deliberately delivered only at a specific time. And inside the envelope, Claire found a single key, an old photograph. Go. And several pages of handwritten notes explaining that Adrian had kept one final secret from the family because he believed revealing it too soon could put them in danger. Go. But now that Nathaniel had retired, Lucian was living openly, and Marcus was permanently imprisoned, Adrian believed the secret could finally be revealed, and the photograph showed a young Nathaniel. Go. Lucian, Adrian, and another man Claire had never seen before standing outside the original research facility. And beneath the photograph was written a name, Samuel Arden. Go, the father of Nathaniel and Lucian, a man Claire had always believed had died peacefully years before the original accident. But Adrian's notes revealed something completely different. Go, explaining that Samuel had been involved in the earliest stage of the research and had discovered the potential danger long before his sons did, and shortly before his death. Go, he had hidden a collection of documents somewhere outside the city because he feared that one day the research would be misused. Go. And the key Claire had received was supposedly connected to that hidden location, but what shocked her most was a sentence written at the bottom of the final page. Go. Your father never knew the whole truth about his own father. Claire immediately brought the letter to Nathaniel, who stared at it for several minutes without speaking. Well, go. And when Claire asked whether he knew about Samuel's hidden research, Nathaniel admitted that he had known his father worked on something unusual. Go. But he had never known the details because Samuel had deliberately kept his sons away from the most dangerous parts of the project, and Lucian, upon seeing the photograph, Go immediately recognized the unknown man standing beside Samuel, saying that he was Dr. Elias Ward, a scientist who had disappeared shortly before the original accident, and according to Lucian, Go, Elias had been one of the few people who believed the technology should never be developed beyond the laboratory, but he vanished after an argument with Samuel. Well, Go. And nobody ever discovered what happened to him. And suddenly the family realized that Marcus's conspiracy might not have been the beginning of the story at all. Go, but only one chapter in a much older conflict, and Claire felt a familiar fear returning, not because she believed another conspiracy was waiting for them, Go, but because she knew how easily old secrets could reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal, Yet Nathaniel surprised her by saying that they should investigate. We'll go, not because he wanted to uncover another enemy, but because he was tired of allowing unanswered questions to control their family. Go. And the three of them traveled together to a small, abandoned railway station outside the city, where the key opened an old storage room that had been untouched for decades. Go, and inside they discovered dozens of sealed boxes containing photographs, research notes, letters, and personal journals written by Samuel Arden. And as Claire read the first few pages, she discovered something that changed her understanding of her family completely, because Samuel had not been obsessed with power or wealth. He had been trying to create a technology that could provide unlimited clean energy, but he became frightened when he discovered that the system was reacting to human biological patterns. And he feared that someone would eventually try to turn human beings into components of the machine, which was exactly what later happened to Claire. And at the very end of Samuel's journal was a warning written only weeks before his death. If they ever discover the child, do not let them convince you that she is a weapon. Claire froze when she read those words, because the journal had been written before she was born, which meant that her grandfather had somehow known that a child would become connected to the technology. And Nathaniel looked at his daughter with the same stunned expression, realizing that the mystery surrounding Claire had begun long before he understood it, and suddenly the family was faced with a new question, one that none of them had expected to ask after so many years of peace. If Samuel had known what would happen, then who had told him? Part 12, T-9th Bo Tugarai page. The answer came from a second journal hidden beneath the floorboards of the storage room, and when Claire opened it, she discovered that Samuel had been communicating secretly with Dr. Elias Ward for years, even after Elias supposedly disappeared. And their letters revealed that the two men had been working together to prevent a dangerous branch of the research from being completed. But Samuel eventually discovered that several powerful investors had already begun funding experiments involving human biological responses. And he feared that his own sons could become targets if they learned too much. So he deliberately separated Nathaniel and Lucian from the research, hoping they would build ordinary lives away from it. But the plan failed because both brothers inherited their father's intelligence and curiosity, and eventually they found the hidden laboratory themselves, which explained why Nathaniel and Lucian had become involved in the project despite Samuel's warnings. And Claire began to realize that the family had been repeating the same pattern for generations. Each generation trying to protect the next by hiding information, only for the secrets to return in a more dangerous form. And as she continued reading, she discovered that Elias had survived his disappearance and had spent decades living under another identity, quietly monitoring the research from a distance. And the most shocking part was that he had recently contacted Adrian shortly before Adrian's death, meaning there was a chance that Elias was still alive. And if he was alive, he might know why Samuel had predicted Claire's connection to the technology before she was even born. So Claire, Nathaniel, and Lucian began searching for him. Following clues hidden inside Samuel's journals that eventually led them to a small mountain village where an elderly man named Elias Ward lived alone in a modest house surrounded by books, scientific equipment, and old photographs. And when Claire introduced herself, Elias immediately knew who she was, saying, your grandfather was afraid you would inherit the burden. And Claire asked what he meant, but Elias refused to answer until Nathaniel entered the room. And the moment he saw him, Elias became visibly emotional because Nathaniel was the son of his closest friend and also the man he blamed for allowing the original research to fall into dangerous hands. But instead of accusing him, Elias simply said, you finally came? And Nathaniel replied, I didn't know where to look. And Elias answered, you were looking for enemies when you should have been looking for the truth. And that sentence reminded Claire of everything her father had learned over the years. Because once again, he had believed the danger came from outside the family, while the real problem had always been the fear and secrecy inside it. And Elias finally explained that Claire's biological connection to the technology was not an accident caused by the explosion, but the result of a failed attempt by Samuel to neutralize the system before it could be weaponized. And when Claire's mother was pregnant, Samuel secretly exposed the system to a biological stabilizing field in an attempt to prevent a catastrophic reaction, unaware that the unborn child would absorb part of the field. And that child was Claire, which meant Claire was never created as an experiment, never intended to be used, and never meant to become a weapon. She was simply the unintended survivor of a desperate attempt to stop something dangerous. And Elias looked directly at her and said, your grandfather spent the rest of his life believing that one day someone would try to turn you into something you were never meant to be. And Claire asked why Samuel never told Nathaniel. And Elias answered, because your grandfather made the same mistake your father made. He believed silence was protection. And Nathaniel lowered his head because he knew the words were true. And then Elias revealed one final piece of information, saying that Marcus Vane had not discovered Claire through his own research. Someone inside the government had given him the information. and that person had never been identified, meaning that even after Marcus's arrest, someone else might still know the truth about Claire, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel's old fear returned. We'll go. But Claire placed her hand on his shoulder and said, this time we face it together. And Nathaniel nodded, because unlike the first time, he no longer intended to decide everything alone. Go. Part 13. The discovery that someone else might still be searching for Claire changed the atmosphere around the family. Go. But Claire refused to return to the life of hiding that her father had once created for her, because she had finally learned that fear could control a person just as effectively as any prison. Go. And she refused to let the past decide her future, so instead of disappearing, she decided to investigate the remaining network herself. Go. Using the Foundation's resources and the documents recovered from Samuel's archive. Go. And within weeks, she discovered financial connections between several companies that had survived the collapse of Marcus's organization. Will go. All of them connected through a mysterious investment group known only as the Meridian Circle, and what frightened Claire was that the group had existed before Marcus, before the original accident, will go, and possibly even before Samuel began his research, meaning that the people who had tried to control the technology were not a single organization but a network that had survived for generations. Go. And when Nathaniel learned what Claire was doing, he initially reacted exactly as she expected, telling her to stop. Will go, saying that he had spent his entire life trying to keep her away from people like them. But Claire refused. Go, telling him that he had already taught her what happened when people kept secrets instead of confronting problems. Go, and Nathaniel finally realized that protecting Claire no longer meant choosing her path for her, so he agreed to help, and together they began tracing the Meridian Circle's activities. Go. Discovering that the group had recently begun investing in medical technology companies, renewable energy companies, and artificial intelligence firms. Will go, suggesting that their interest was no longer limited to the original energy system, but had expanded toward technologies capable of interacting directly with human biology. Go, and then Claire discovered something terrifying. One of the companies had recently purchased a private medical facility where she had been treated as a child. Go. And suddenly she understood that someone had been monitoring her health long before she ever knew there was anything unusual about her. And when she confronted her father, Go, Nathaniel admitted that he had suspected this for years, but he had never found enough evidence to prove it. And Claire became furious, accusing him of once again hiding information. Will go, but Nathaniel answered calmly, I was afraid if I told you, you would spend your life looking over your shoulder. And Claire replied, Go, I already have, and those words finally broke through the wall between them. Because Nathaniel realized that even when he tried to protect her, Will go, he was still making decisions based on his fear rather than her freedom, and he apologized not for loving her, but for failing to trust her, and Claire forgave him. Go. Not because the past was suddenly acceptable, but because she could see that he was finally learning. Go. And soon the family discovered that the Meridian Circle was planning to acquire the remaining research connected to Claire. And their leader was someone Claire had never heard of. Go, a woman named Vivian Ashford, a former government scientist who worked with Samuel decades earlier and had disappeared after the original accident. And unlike Marcus, Go, Vivian did not want revenge, she wanted control, believing that humanity could only survive if dangerous technologies were controlled by people intelligent enough to use them responsibly. Go. And she believed Claire's existence proved that human biology could be integrated with advanced energy systems, making Claire not merely a person in her eyes. Go. But the key to a future she believed she had the right to create. And when Vivian finally contacted Claire directly, she did not threaten her. She offered her a choice. Go. Saying that Claire could help create a new system that would eliminate global energy shortages and save millions of lives. Will go. Or she could refuse and allow governments and corporations to continue fighting over the technology until another war began. Go. And Claire was shaken because for the first time the enemy's argument did not sound completely unreasonable. And that was exactly what made the decision so difficult. Will go, because perhaps Vivienne was not entirely wrong about the potential benefits. But Claire knew what happened when people believed that a good goal justified any sacrifice. Go. And she refused to become another generation's excuse for doing something dangerous. So she told Vivienne, if saving the world requires taking away someone else's right to choose, go. Then you're not saving the world. And Vivienne smiled sadly before saying, then perhaps you are exactly what your grandfather hoped you would become. And the call ended. Go. Leaving Claire with one terrible realization. Vivienne knew Samuel personally, and she might know what really happened during the final days of his life. Go, part 14. Tilashka Varsatai on Claire and her family traveled to the place where Samuel had spent his final years, an old cabin hidden deep within the mountains. Go. And inside they discovered one final recording that Samuel had left behind, not for Nathaniel, not for Lucian, but for Claire. And as the recording began, go. Samuel appeared on an old screen looking much younger than Claire, remembered from photographs, and he spoke directly to the camera. Go. Explaining that he had known there was a possibility Claire would one day become connected to the technology. And he wanted her to understand that she had never been responsible for what happened, go, that she had never been a weapon, never been a mistake, and never owed anyone her abilities, and he apologized for the decisions he had made, especially the decision to hide the truth from his sons, will go because he had believed that secrecy could protect them, only to discover too late that secrets did not disappear when people refused to speak about them. Go, they simply passed from one generation to another, becoming heavier each time. Go. And Claire cried as she watched the recording because she finally understood that the secret she had spent years searching for was not a secret about technology at all. It was a secret about fear. Well, go, and Samuel had been afraid, Nathaniel had been afraid, Lucian had been afraid, Elena had been afraid. Go. And Claire had inherited not only the biological consequences of the research, but also the emotional consequences of generations of people who believed love meant protection through silence. Go. And at the end of the recording, Samuel said one final thing. If you are watching this, then the secret has survived longer than I ever wanted it to. Will go. But you do not have to carry it forward. And those words became Claire's answer because she realized that she did not need to destroy the technology, hide it, or control it. Go. She simply needed to make sure no one person could ever own it. And with the help of Lucian, Elias, Nathaniel, and independent scientists, go, she released the complete research to the public under strict ethical conditions, ensuring that no corporation or government could secretly control it, and Vivienne confronted her one final time, go, asking whether she understood what she had done, because by releasing the information, Claire had removed herself from the center of the conflict. Go, but she had also given humanity access to knowledge that could be misused, and Claire answered that she knew the risk, go, but she believed transparency and shared responsibility were safer than secrecy and control, and Vivienne looked at her for a long time before saying, go. Your grandfather would have been proud. And then she surrendered the remaining documents to authorities, ending the Meridian Circle's influence, but the victory was not without pain, go, because Nathaniel later admitted that part of him had wanted Claire to destroy everything because destruction would have guaranteed her safety, and Claire smiled and said, go. You still want to protect me from the world. And Nathaniel laughed, admitting that he probably always would, but this time he added, go. I just won't decide for you anymore. And Claire hugged him, and that simple moment meant more than any public victory. Go. Because their relationship had finally become what it should have been from the beginning, not a relationship between a father who protects and a daughter who obeys. Go. But a relationship between two adults who trusted one another enough to disagree. And that night, as they returned to the coastal house, Claire found herself standing once again beside the sea, go, remembering the first time her father had told her that he built the house because he wanted to keep the past away. And now she understood that the house had never been a fortress. Go, it had been a monument to fear, and perhaps the best way to honor the people who had suffered was not to keep the doors locked forever, but to open them. Go. Pi FTHE FML while FT Bina many years later, when Claire's children were old enough to understand the history of their family, go. She took them into the old underground room beneath the house, the same room where she had first discovered the truth about Nathaniel, Lucian, Marcus, Samuel, and herself, go. But the room was no longer dark or frightening because the walls had been renovated, the old documents were carefully preserved, go, and the silver pendant rested inside a glass case beneath a photograph of the entire Arden family. And when Claire's children asked why their family had so many secrets, go, and Claire smiled before answering that every family had things it was afraid to talk about. But the important thing was what they chose to do with those secrets, go. And she told them the story of Nathaniel, the father who thought protection meant silence of Lucian, the brother who thought sacrifice meant disappearing of Elena, go, who spent years trying to keep peace by hiding her fear of Samuel, who believed he could control the future through knowledge, and of herself, go, the daughter who eventually discovered that the greatest inheritance her family had given her was not wealth, technology, or a famous name, but the opportunity to choose differently, go. And her children listened carefully as she explained that their family had survived not because they were stronger than everyone else, but because they eventually learned to admit when they were wrong, go. And one of them asked whether she was angry at her grandfather, and Claire paused before saying that anger and love could exist at the same time, go. That forgiveness did not mean pretending someone had never hurt you, and that understanding someone's reasons did not mean agreeing with their choices, go. But sometimes forgiveness was simply deciding that you would not allow another person's mistake to become the foundation of your own life. And as she finished telling the story, Nathaniel, now very old, go, entered the room carrying a small box, and Claire smiled when she saw it because she knew exactly what was inside the original silver pendant, and Nathaniel placed it in her hands, go, telling her that he had spent most of his life believing that the pendant represented danger, but now he believed it represented something else, go, a reminder that the past could be carried without being obeyed. And Claire looked at the pendant before placing it back inside the glass case. And then the family went upstairs where dinner was waiting, go. And for a moment, Claire looked around the table and realized how different everything had become, Go, because once this table had been a place where Nathaniel repeated the same sentence about protecting the family while everyone silently carried secrets. Go, but now it was a place where people argued openly, laughed loudly, asked uncomfortable questions, and sometimes disagreed without fear. Will go. And Claire smiled because she finally understood what her father had been trying to teach them all those years. He had simply misunderstood the lesson. Family did need to protect each other. Go. But protection was not about hiding the truth, controlling choices, or carrying burdens alone. True protection meant being honest enough to let someone prepare for the truth. Go. Brave enough to stand beside them when the truth hurt, and humble enough to admit when your own choices had caused pain. And as the evening continued, go. Nathaniel looked around the table and said the sentence he had repeated thousands of times throughout his life. No matter what happens outside these walls, go, we protect each other inside them. But this time Claire interrupted him with a smile and said, and we tell each other the truth. And everyone laughed, including Nathaniel. Go, because the sentence had finally become complete. And outside the house, the sea moved gently beneath the moonlight. Go. Just as it had on the night Claire first discovered that her perfect family was not what she thought it was. But now she no longer needed perfection, because she had learned something far more valuable. Go. That families were not made strong by having no secrets, no mistakes, or no pain. They were made strong when people were willing to face those things together. Go. And the Arden family would always carry the scars of the past, but they would no longer carry them as chains. They would carry them as reminders of how far they had come. Go. And perhaps that was the true ending of the story beneath the silver house. Not a story about a mysterious technology, not a story about a powerful family. Go. And not even a story about a secret that survived for generations, but a story about people who finally realized that the greatest danger was never the truth itself. Go. The greatest danger was believing that the people we love were too fragile to handle it, because sometimes the most loving thing we can do is not hide the truth from someone. Go. But stand beside them when they finally hear it. And when Claire looked around that table one last time, she knew that the family her father had spent his entire life trying to protect was finally safe. Go. Not because the world could never hurt them again, but because they no longer had to face the world alone. And that was the legacy they chose to leave behind.